Hello everyone, welcome back to the Fafnir guide. I'm re-updating this because it's been a while and I got a request from Jonas Rodriguez to update Fafnir. So here we are. Quite a few things have changed since we last talked about Fafnir, so it's really worthwhile talking right from the beginning with building Fafnir. Now I'm going to primarily be focusing on support because that is what Fafnir is geared towards. But I will also be talking about solo lane, since Fafnir actually plays pretty well in solo lane, and there's not a whole lot of differences in the build there. In fact, most of the differences between solo lane Fafnir and support Fafnir are in the items you build in the first half of the match, your first 3 items. Those are really the only big differences. The back half tends to build very similarly, but we'll talk about that later on. For now, let's first off talk about starter items for Fafnir. Now, when you're playing support Fafnir, you are primarily looking at 2 starter items. The first is Sentinel's Gift, obviously, right? You get that health, the mana, the gold. Lovely. However, if you have 2 or possibly 3 auto-attackers on your team, not the enemy team, has nothing to do with the enemy team, your team, War Flag is significantly better for Fafnir. There are a couple of very important reasons why. First off, you and nearby allied gods receive a stack that gives 1% movement speed, which doesn't make a huge difference, and 2% attack speed, up to 10 stacks. So this can be up to 20% increase in attack speed. Now, the significant thing here is Coerce, which is one of the more interesting abilities Fafnir has. Boosts the attack speed of the ally, heals himself, which is nice and all, but that's not the big deal. The attack speed boost and the bonus damage. The bonus damage is a percentage of the coerced ally. This is not a percentage of Fafnir's damage. This is a percentage of the enhanced ally. In other words, the higher their attack speed, the more bonus damage they will be dealing. Okay? And that is really, really significant. So the more you can increase allied attack speed, the better Coerce is. Now, again, it's really important to remember that just one ally with an auto attack focus, or even one ally with just one ally with useful auto attacks, isn't enough to justify War Flag, because there's only going to be one ally you're using War Flag for, and if they die in a team fight, there's not much benefit for the rest of your allies, because they're in this particular example, they're all ability based, so they're not going to get a whole lot out of this. But if you have a whole bunch of allies who either have functionally useful auto attacks, even though they're ability based, for example, or could be ability based, like Bellona, for example, even though she can be built ability based, and even if she is built that way, she still has really impressive auto attacks, from the chain whip to the hammer. She still can benefit from this, even if she is going an auto attack build, right? So, if you've got 2+ people who have good auto attacks, or are building auto attack based, War Flag is really great, or you anticipate building auto attack based anyways. And for that reason, this is really, really strong on Fafnir. Additionally, War Banner, when you upgrade to that, because if you're going to build War Flag on Fafnir, you always want War Banner, again, for Coerce. You never want Spartan Flag, not only because this is very specifically a one location, which is a little bit better now that we have Soul Surges. This is actually a bit more significant, but War Flag gives you protections, which you want, which you really want as a support, and each time you damage an enemy god, you restore 1% health and 1.25% mana to nearby allies. Now, even though Coerce is based off of the damage the buffed ally is doing, the damage is sourced from Fafnir. Fafnir, technically speaking, is doing that damage. Even though it's scaled off of the ally's attack, this scales to Fafnir. Which means, if you have War Banner, and every 4 auto attacks a buffed ally hits, heals them if you're nearby. And if you've coerced them, you're nearby, right? And this gets even more egregious when you use the AoE and you buff a whole bunch of people. That is a whole bunch of potential triggers of War Banner. Okay, so War Banner gets really ugly really quickly. Again, 2+ allies with good auto attacks, absolutely go for this. This is significantly more dominating than a lot of people realize. Okay, Fafnir is slept on for primarily this reason as a support. Now, the difference, this is one of the big differences with solo Fafnir. This doesn't work as well for solo Fafnir for the fairly obvious reason that he's in lane by himself, so he can't get assists, so neither Sentinel's Gift nor War Flag are worth it for him. And because his dragon form doesn't proc auto attack effects, Acts of Animosity is only useful when he is not a dragon. Basically, if you run Animosity as Fafnir, you're basically nerfing yourself whenever you go into dragon form, which isn't really what you want to do. So, generally speaking, when playing solo lane Fafnir, there are two things you really want to be looking at here. The first is potentially Sundering Axe. There's a couple of reasons for this. Well, Warrior's Axe to Sundering Axe. This is going to help your health and mana is very important for Fafnir. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but mana is very important for Fafnir, which you potentially will want Warrior's Axe going into Sundering Axe. You get a little bit of power, you get a little bit of protections, you get to steal a percentage of their current health, which is great as a dragon. This can actually help keep you alive, because unfortunately when you untransform from a dragon, you are very hittable, right? You don't have iframes like you do when transforming into the dragon. Transforming out of the dragon can get you killed, so running Sundering Axe as a solo lane Fafnir is going to really help with this. Okay, another potential solution to that issue is Vampiric Shroud, especially if you go into Sacrificial Shroud, which can be quite nice, although a lot of Fafnir's damage is basically what is known as chip damage. It's a lot of really small hits rather than a bunch of big hits. So that passive doesn't stretch quite as far as maybe you'd like, but it does give you some physical protections, it does give you a decent amount of power, it does give you some magic lifesteal. You could also alternatively go for the Blood-Soaked Shroud, which is also going to be really, really nice. And actually, Blood-Soaked Shroud is, frankly, a little bit better for this. I mentioned the Sacrificial Shroud first because a lot of people are going to see that physical protection and go towards that. And that's kind of understandable, but again, that passive doesn't really do much for you as Fafnir. It's not that Fafnir doesn't hit hard, he just hits hard over a period of time, right? Blood-Soaked Shroud is different because your abilities are going to be healing you a percentage of your health and mana, okay? Which is really significant because, of course, let me actually give you an interesting example of this, right? Let's go in here, we'll do, let's do Neath, for kicks. Let's say we go on ahead and proc her, we're starting to take this damage, right? We're getting shot a little bit. There she goes. Now she's hitting us with some actual damage here. We go on ahead and do that, and then we transform into the dragon, which she doesn't shoot you for. And you can see we're getting a lot of little, percentages here because we're getting that poison damage proc, right? It works out fairly nicely because each one of those poison ticks is healing us a little bit of health and mana, which, again, really helps with our mana management for Fafnir. Now, I've been talking a lot about mana management for Fafnir. This is because early on in the game, and even later on in the game, if your cooldowns are low enough, transforming into a dragon can be a bit problematic, right? Yes, he regains 200 mana when he transforms, but the actual the actual mana cost of the ability itself is 70, so you're technically only really getting 130 back, right? Which isn't a hell of a lot, okay? Early on in the game, it's not unusual for you to either want to use Draconic Corruption, and when you do, you barely have any mana to use abilities. Maybe you use 2 abilities once. You'll notice if you get 200 mana back, right, you use this, you get 200 mana back, so you're working with, at minimum, 200 mana. That is enough to cast Cursed Strength and Underhanded Tactics, and in a couple of seconds, depending on what your MP5 is, Coerce right afterwards, once each, right? Which isn't really great. So you need early game mana. So whether you are running solo lane Fafnir or support Fafnir, in this particular example, I'm going to assume support. So we're going to grab War Flag here. But your second item is always going to want Mystical Earring. Now, we're not going to upgrade this immediately when we start increasing our items. We just want this for the MP5. This is going to help you early game a lot with your mana management, okay? Even if you get, regardless of whether you get Vampiric Shroud as a solo Fafnir, Warrior's Axe, War Flag, or Sentinel's Gift, all 4 of these starter items, and this is the significant thing, all 4 of these starter items are going to give you mana. You could, as a solo lane Fafnir, also grab Sands of Time. My main issue with that is that it's not really buffing any of your defensive stats until late in the game when you go alternate timeline, and that's rarely useful for its passive. It's a decent little item by itself, but when you do get this, you lose the mana. Not the biggest fan. It is an option if you really prefer to lean on Sands of Time for cooldown damage and MP5. You can, just as an aside, but generally speaking, not my go-to. You die a little too quickly in the solo lane for my personal tastes. Or even in the support role, you die a little too quick with this. But Mystical Earring is great. Later on in the game, we're going to want to upgrade this to Manticore Spikes because you have a really significant amount of crowd control that can proc this. I'll talk about that when we get to the actual upgrading to this point. But this pays off dividends. This is a really great second item. Again, whether you're solo lane or you're support Fafnir, grab this second item. It's nice and cheap, and you're really setting yourself up quite nicely. And then, afterwards, if you're if you're support Fafnir, you are going to generally want to go into Prophetic Cloak. Now, Prophetic Cloak is fairly interesting, where's the stacks? There it is. A lot of supports, now that they've nerfed protections, it's a little bit harder to attain the 600 total protections, right? It's a little bit more difficult for a lot of gods to achieve this, but because of Fafnir's passive giving him up to 35 of each protection, this is actually quite a bit easier for him, okay? This actually is quite manageable in most situations. So, broadly speaking, Prophetic Cloak can work out really nicely for Fafnir because you're actually pretty likely to reach that threshold of 600 total protections. Right? You're going to have an easier time doing that. Now, your fourth item as a support Fafnir, now you have a choice, right? Now you've got your Prophetic Cloak. If you're going to go for Gauntlet of Thebes, this is the time to do it, and then you go into Manticore Spikes, right? Because you can see we have quite a tasty number of protections here. This is typically what a lot of people do to sort of compensate for the decreased protections total, because, of course, Gauntlet of Thebes is still giving really substantial amounts of protections. It's still giving you 55 total, including that aura. And then you would theoretically want to go into Manticore Spikes. If you're not going to run Gauntlet of Thebes, upgrade Manticore Spikes first, then go into your other items, right? Now, what's fairly interesting is typically at this point that I'll grab Shogun's Kusari. Again, we are just looking to increase our allies' attack speed for Coerce. You'll notice we really don't need any physical protection item specifically. That's not too unusual. We go on ahead and upgrade War Banner, and now we are hitting pretty damn close to max protections, and we still have a spare slot. Again, this is partially due to Fafnir's passive pushing us over, but now we've got some options, okay? Now, there are a couple of items as a final item slot that I am pretty fond of using. Now, first off, it is worth mentioning that the Abyssal Stone is extremely nice on Fafnir, and this is very often, when I'm playing support Fafnir, this is very often what I'm grabbing. There are a couple of reasons why. Now, you'll notice I'm overcapping here, and it's allowing me to overcap. This is because his passive actually allows you mildly to overcap this, because there's this really kind of, and this is inconsistent with passives, which is really interesting, but some passives allow you to overcap. Alright? You can see that here. You can see that here. If it'll let me... Does it not let me anymore? There we go. Right? It actually has the 353, 357 here. Normally that would just flat out cap at 325. It's not really that big of a deal because the actual returns from that are really mild, because protections have diminishing returns, which means the more protections you have, the less effective the next point of protection is. So that really isn't that big of a deal, which is probably why they allow it. It's like 1 or 2% less damage, or less damage you're taking. Fun little fact, though. Anyways, Abyssal Stone is really nice because it's your ability damage that applies the debuff for negative CDR, including your poisons, which qualifies as ability damage. So when we use our ult, say we get her poisoned, right? You do that, and then you boom, and then she's stunned for an extra long time. Boom, she's stunned for an extra long time, and any other ally crowd control is going to last for an extra long amount of time there. Okay? That's really potent. And this is why Abyssal Stone is one of my favorite items to use at the end. Now, I use it at the end because by this time your debuffs, your crowd control is going to be at its highest, your stun is going to be highest, your allies' crowd control is going to be at its highest. Right, you're going to have all of this. You can build that earlier if you really want to. In fact, sometimes I build it 5th instead of Shogun's Kusari and end the match with Shogun's Kusari. It really depends on the situation. If I have War Flag, I'm running Shogun's Kusari 5th. If I have Sentinel's Gift, I'm doing Shogun's Kusari last. Just as my usual rule of thumb there. But Abyssal Stone is grotesquely useful on Fafnir as a support. Okay, even as a solo lane, this is very, very difficult to deal with. Alright? Not a whole lot of crowd control benefits from Abyssal Stone. Alright, any crowd control that is directly tied to its duration, for example, Ganesha's Silence, does not benefit from this, but all of Fafnir's crowd control is separate from him. It does not rely on anything but just hitting the ability, and then boom, you've got crowd control. Abyssal Stone makes all of that much stronger. Even his disarm lasts longer, which can be really problematic for any auto-attacking enemies like the enemy ADC. That's going to be very problematic for them to deal with. It's going to be very tough for them to deal with. Okay? And of course, incidentally, by the way, Manticore's Spike procs off of the disarm from underhanded tactics. You can, and a lot, the most interesting thing about Fafnir with Manticore Spikes is the Manticore Spikes spawn underneath you, so you pretty much almost, well, that one doesn't. This one does, because you actually are in melee range, right? So we coerce, boom, and boom. If you're in melee range, everything you do is going to, every Manticore Spike you proc is going to, I have to move a little bit to pick this one up. It disappeared first. But you can see I picked that up right away. Boom, there's another one. Grab that. Coerce, boom. Right? The hammer does spawn where the hammer impact is, but you typically are going to be using underhanded tactics after the fact anyways, so it's not really that big of a deal a lot of the times. But it's very easy for Fafnir to pick up his own Manticore Spikes. Of course, we do have the MP5 here. We have the MP5 here, which is great. Again, we want that MP5 to help us have enough mana to utilize the Fafnir's ult, but there are a couple of other items as a last option you might be interested in going with as well. Another good item to get, let me sell this really quick, another good item to get is the Relic Dagger. I very rarely recommend the Relic Dagger because I find it a little underpowered, but with Fafnir, if you take Belt of Frenzy as your second item, you go on ahead and either go with Belt of Insatiable Hunger or the Belt of the Berserker, which is my personal favorite. You can get this, buff your allies' attack speed, and then boom, you can use this every minute. Alright, and this is great for team fights, Fire Giant, the enemy Titan. This is very difficult to deal with. Again, you ult, blast out a Belt of Insatiable Hunger or a Belt of Berserker, either one, your preference, they're both very good, you can do a lot of damage, especially, again, you're increasing your allies' attack speed. Combine that with the War Banner, and you can cause a lot of problems for the enemy here. Alright, and on top of that, but you also have a glyph you can now grab. I typically run Eldritch Dagger, because this is going to help keep me alive to help, increase that attack speed further with Coerce while I'm a dragon. And I really like that. But if the enemy team has a lot of auto-attackers, the Bewitched Dagger is also very effective. But the Relic Dagger, Fafnir is one of the very few gods where I more consistently grab Relic Dagger. Again, it's not something I recommend very often, but it can be incredibly powerful on Fafnir if used correctly. So that's another great item that I really like throwing in there, just to really increase my impact on my allies' attack speed and the frequency at which I can use Berserker, right? Incredibly dangerous. So we do have that. Those are my two favorite last items. If the enemy team composition has an abnormally high amount of auto-attackers, magic damage dealers, I will sometimes grab Talisman of Energy as a last item, just in case they're reducing magic protections, whatever. This is extremely rare, by the way. Extremely rare, and even then, a lot of times, because we're already so close to max protections, a lot of the times this isn't necessary in the first place. There are some hyper-specific scenarios in which I have found this useful. Say, there's a lot of magic auto-attackers on the enemy team. Maybe they have an Ao Kuang Jungle, a mid-lane Soul, and a Chronos ADC. A lot of them are going to be building, at least one of them, usually two, builds Demonic Grip, which really reduces your magic protections down, so Talisman of Energy can really pull its weight there. But even then, again, a lot of the times, this is just a little bit too extreme. A lot of the times, it's still more effective to build one of the other two items. Just something to be keeping in mind in case they have a ton of auto-attacking magic damage, and you're figuring they're going to be building Demonic Grip. This can be useful in that situation. But again, even then, I would still rather use Bewitching Dagger. It's just worth mentioning really quick. Beyond that, there's not really a whole lot else I build as a final item. It's primarily Abyssal Stone or Relic Dagger. Once in a blue moon, I'll go either Contagion here. It is also worth mentioning, actually, speaking of anti-healing, if I need anti-healing, I'm actually more likely to go for Divine Ruin rather than Contagion or Pestilence, and there's a very specific reason why. Again, this comes back to the poison, right? Whenever you're in dragon form, that poison lasts a good amount of time. In fact, very specifically, it lasts... How long does the poison last? Taking damage 3 seconds. So over 3 seconds, right? And all of your basic attacks, of course, also have a 3-second poison attached to them. So when you're in dragon form and you build Divine Ruin, that is 5 seconds after those 3 seconds of poison, okay? That's a long time. That is 8 whole damn seconds in which they are only getting 60% of their healing. Okay, furthermore, this also gives you that really interesting chain lightning that happens every 20 seconds, which isn't going to hit them very hard. Let's be really honest. You're a support Fafnir, or a solo Fafnir. This is also something I build on solo Fafnir. This is usually a solo Fafnir thing, by the way, but I have sometimes done this with support Fafnir. But anyways, you are dealing like 47 damage on paper. Honestly, with their protections, it's a little less, but that's fine. But this is really nice for anti-healing. This is a really extended anti-healing. I find this a bit more useful for anti-healing purposes than Pestilence or Contagion. But that's just been my personal experience. Very useful item indeed. It's just really quite useful for those purposes. If you want to splash in a little damage as a support or a solo Fafnir, you can go Soul Reaver. Alright? Which, even though subsequent hits do half the bonus damage, it still is really nice. Right? To actually do some percentage damage. You could also go with Tablet of Destinies, although by this point, it's pretty damn late. If you want to build this earlier as a solo, let's actually go back a little bit, right? Because as a solo lane Fafnir, things run a bit differently. I prefer Warrior's Axe, so we're going to use this for an example, but don't feel locked into that. Still use Mystical Earring. Now, we're going to assume our laning opponent is physical, because that's most of them. Generally speaking, you are going to want, as your third item, you're going to be either looking for Gladiator's Shield, which is the usual, right? Get that bonus damage on there. Again, your passive is going to give you slightly more damage out of this, which is really great. This is also going to give you physical damage, which is really important for a solo lane Fafnir, because most of your laning opponents, when they first realize, hey, I'm facing Fafnir, they're going to switch from building physical, at least most of the time. I've fought a couple of people who are stuck with the physical protections for some reason, but anyways, they're going to switch from building the physical protections they were originally going to go with to magic protections. But that doesn't help them against Gladiator's Shield damage, because that's physical. So, as a solo lane Fafnir, you don't necessarily need to worry too much about them building magic protections, because you can get around that to some extent with the physical damage from Gladiator's Shield, which is just a really great time. And this is absolutely fantastic for that reason. Lovely time. Absolutely hugely devastating to an enemy solo laner, right? Especially if there's someone like Bellona or Erlong Shen who you can disarm and really mitigate their damage output in that period of time, right? In fact, even if like Gilgamesh, for instance, or maybe even, that early in the game, they don't have cooldowns, so they're still auto-attacking between abilities. Disarm is still quite useful. So you have that. Very, very potent. Then, typically, at this particular point in time, you've got two options. You can either start working on another physical protection item, or your Manticore Spikes. Typically, I run Manticore Spikes at this particular point in time. It's going to give you more MP5, which as a solo laner you really want. It is going to give you the Manticore Spikes, as we already discussed, is very useful. Right? It's going to give you those protections. Now that we have Soul Surges, rotations from solo lane to mid lane happen a little earlier, so it's a pretty important idea to grab some magic protections a little earlier, and the best way to do so from solo lane is to have your third item be a dual protection item. That way you're still getting the physical protections you need, and also you are getting some magic protections to help against the enemy mid laner. Then, of course, at this particular point in time, I will typically still grab Abyssal Stone, right? Very popular here for me. Big fan of this, but if you want to splash in some damage as Fafnir, what you build here instead, it's a little late, but it can still really work out well, is Tablet of Destinies, alright? Because you can, again, deal quite a bit of damage through Tablet of Destinies here as a solo lane Fafnir without actually having to invest too much in power. There's another alternative, though, which is really interesting, which is Soul Gem, right? Now, Soul Gem is fairly interesting because you can help keep yourself alive here. Right, boom, there's a second stack right there, boom. And then the Coerce also procs that. Again, Coerce is you doing damage. So if you want to use Soul Gem for a little bit of bonus healing, that is something you can do. Again, Coerce gives you that stack, okay? I typically run Tablet of Destinies. If I'm going to be splashing in some damage, it is usually going to be Tablet of Destinies out of me. Usually. Not all the time. Sometimes I do like a Soul Gem. If the enemy team composition is higher in damage than average, I will throw on the Soul Gem. This will help keep my allies alive. This will help keep me alive. This will help me get a little bit of damage. This will give me some cooldowns. This will give me some magic lifesteal. It's just a really strong item on Fafnir, solo Fafnir. For that reason, you are going to get those stacks up quite nicely. And it can be fairly useful. They did nerf it So in recent times, I've been using this less because now it's a flat heal rather than a percentage heal. It makes it a little bit better for solo lane, but it's not as good as it used to be, generally speaking. But it's still a viable option. It still can be really good, even in those circumstances, okay? So that's up to you if you want to go Soul Gem, if you want to go with Tablet of Destinies, or if you want to run right into Abyssal Stone. That's all your choice, right? We're going to just assume Tablet of Destinies here just for a little bit of damage in there. Grab Abyssal Stone, of course, and we're still going to be looking to build the Shogun's Kusari for that magic protections, right? Sundering Axe. And you can see we've got a really nice combination of, we've got some good protections here, we've got a little bit of damage. Of course, again, if you prefer not to run Tablet of Destinies, you want to get some more protections in there, totally fine. Personally, I'll typically grab Pridwin as a solo lane Fafnir, because you do get that shield that explodes, it adds to your damage a little bit, you get some cooldowns, you get 40% cooldowns. You can either run the Reverend Pridwin, which personally is my favorite. Again, you have that passive, you have really huge protections, so that initial shield you get, that's 200% of your protections. That's huge, right? And then you blast out the damage from the explosion, or you can go with the Glorious Pridwin, still very useful. That one's, again, down to your preference, but if I am not building Tablet of Destinies or Soul Gem, I am running Pridwin, okay? Usually, again, this is actually, I've got the order different here because I was giving you an example of the damage, because if I'm going to build damage, my damage is going to be that 4th slot. But if I'm looking to not run damage, Abyssal Stone is actually my 4th, I run Pridwin 5th, and Shogun's Kusari 6th. Alright, generally speaking, that's usually my approach. But that's usually how I approach Fafnir, both in the support and the solo lane builds. Now, for your relics, this can be fairly interesting, because for the first relic, there are two really strong options for Fafnir. Obviously, the first one I mentioned was Belt of Frenzy, but the second one is Cloak of Meditation. Now, I don't normally like Cloak of Meditation in Conquest, it's a little too weak, but again, Fafnir really wants that health and mana, and when you go Cloak of Meditation, I don't know why it went there, but that's fine. You can get Cloak of the Ascetic, which reduces the cooldowns of your abilities by 1.5 for each pulse, right? Which is really, really nice, because this also affects your ult. So you get your ult a little bit faster. Okay? Now, this is obviously for support Fafnir. If you're solo lane Fafnir, you want the teleport. You want the teleport as solo lane Fafnir specifically because, again, mana. You are, even with the blue buff, even with the earrings, you're still going to occasionally encounter the severe problem of mana control. And your early game as Fafnir can be a little rough because Coerce isn't hugely damaging. In fact, a lot of the times when I'm playing solo lane Fafnir, I don't necessarily level up Coerce until the other two are maxed. Just because in a lot of situations early on in the game, that's 4% of your auto attack damage, and Fafnir's auto attack damage is trash at level 1 through 20. So, not really a big deal there. But you absolutely want the teleport fragment. But for support Fafnir, Cloak of Meditation, Belt of Frenzy, these both are really strong items. Whichever one I don't get as support Fafnir, if I don't get Belt of Frenzy as my first relic, it is always my second relic. If Belt of Frenzy is my first relic, let me get rid of this really quick. If Belt of Frenzy is my first relic, then my second relic isn't necessarily Cloak of Meditation. I'll build Cursed Ankh if they have a lot of healing. I have also been known to grab Blink sometimes. What's also fairly interesting is, a lot of times, this is actually my third favorite relic on support Fafnir, grab Heavenly Wings and go for Hastened Wings, because, of course, even though your Acid Breath doesn't really scale off of your attack damage, obviously, right? it's still a basic attack. And this, since this isn't an effect of, let me actually show you here. There we go. There's the Odinbots. We can have ourselves a really grand time where, you know, going really slow, and then we have this really great way where we can maintain pace with enemies and breathe acid on them if they're trying to escape. So I'm actually, unusually, rather fond of, very specifically, the Hastened Wings as a support Fafnir. This also helps your allies, again, maintain pace while you have them coerced, which is really helpful. But this is my usual relic setup for support Fafnir a lot of the times. Okay? I find this very, very useful. Sometimes I'll get Meditation and Belt of the Berserker, or Belt, again, if you prefer the other belt there, Belt of Insatiable Hunger. But this is my usual go-to. The only time I really want Meditation over Belt of Frenzy as my first relic is, again, high damage enemy team compositions. Alright, that's very specifically when I want Meditation, because Meditation will help manage that damage a little bit better. Okay? But again, that's going to come down to your personal preferences overall. It is also worth noting, although now I no longer have that ability to do so, it is also worth noting, yeah, we're going to go on ahead and sell the items, because what I want to do right now is talk really quickly about glyphs before we finish this. Well, there's two other things I want to talk about. First is glyphs. Here we go. Glyphs. It's not going to let me look at the glyphs. Alright, that's fine. When I run glyphs on Fafnir, I never get the one where your auto attack decreases. There it goes. No, it doesn't. There it doesn't go. Here, no, it's not going to let me for some bizarre reason. Nope, we're just... That's an interesting glitch. Okay. Anyways, so for glyphs, I don't go with the one that the gray one that I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head right now. The one that reduces enemy protections when you auto attack them, because that can't proc off of the dragon. So it becomes this really, if you want to take advantage of it while you're in dragon form, it becomes this really awkward jig where you're trying to hit them with the auto attack to reduce their protections and then transform, which doesn't do you a whole lot of good because you're in the middle of transforming. What I typically like to do is either grab the claw that reduces your cooldowns, because you can use that in dragon form to get your abilities back faster, which is really useful, or the red one that gives you lifesteal on everything you do, because that's going to help you stay alive as a dragon in that early game when things get a little bit rough, and that's going to help you more likely survive your untransformation if you didn't win the fight, right? So it's going to be one of those two, and a lot of times, usually I go for the cooldown one. Again, it's very useful for using after you transform, you use all of your abilities, you use the claw, and even in the early game, you can typically get 2 uses of each ability out of that single transformation, even with a level 1 transformation. Alright, so that's my usual favorite there. Second thing I want to talk about is, I guess we'll go to level 20 again. You might be wondering, and I'm going to save you some headache. You might be wondering, well, Professor, with the Acid Breath, can't you just run Gilded Arrow and get the advantage of that with your Dragon Breath? Not really. Lo and behold, let me show you. Let me do a very direct comparison really quick for you. 37 damage, right? Great. Good thing this lasts a whole minute. Grab Diamond Arrow. We have a 70 increase in our basic attack damage. 38. The damage of this is not actually, and you can see it right here, the Dragon Breath damage scales off of your magic power, but not your actual basic attack damage, right? So trying to go for basic attack damage means absolutely nothing, and just so you can see the animosity not do anything, does not trigger animosity, alright? You are way better off grabbing either Sundering Axe for the increase in magic power, which is going to give you 39, of course, or you go for the ever-famous Blood-Soaked Shroud, which is going to give you 41, right? So your Dragon Breath doesn't actually, despite the fact that it's technically a basic attack, it doesn't scale off of your basic attack damage. So if you're looking to be a solo lane Fafnir, don't bother with Gilded Arrow or Diamond Arrow. Don't bother with Mannequin Mace. Again, don't bother with Animosity. None of these are going to help you. None of them. Doesn't matter. But with that being said, that is building Fafnir in 2023. He is underrated, in my opinion. Mostly because his early game is really tough. Alright, you're going to see that when I do the Conquest example. His early game is a little rough. Depending on... Well, I won't say his early game is a little rough because that's not quite accurate. His early game is very heavily dependent on how good his ADC is. This is true to some extent of all supports, but for Fafnir, because Coerce really relies on your ally hitting those autos and actually taking advantage of that increased attack speed, because in the early game, obviously, 4% of your allies' damage dealt is pathetic, right? 4%, that's tickling them. It's really the attack speed buff that you're using that for, right? But your ally has to be good enough to, you know, land hits. So if your ADC sucks at hitting auto attacks, you're going to have a really bad time with Fafnir. If your ADC is really good at hitting auto attacks, you are going to absolutely dominate with early game Fafnir. Alright, this is so grossly dependent on your allies. If you have a mid lane mage that has good auto attacks, again, Kronos or Sol or someone like that, your mid game is also going to be really good as well. But the mid game can also be very rough with Fafnir if your ADC sucks. If your ADC has a rough time in the early game, you're going to have a rough time, and you're not going to go into that mid game with any kind of lead, which is going to hurt you, because a lot of the times with Fafnir, most mages, most mid laners aren't running auto attacks, right? For very obvious reasons. Most mages are ability based. So when you get to that mid game point, Coerce isn't that useful a lot of the times until you get into the late game and you're teaming back up with people who have good auto attacks. Sometimes if your jungler is an auto attacker, that can help to some extent, but you really want to be entering that mid game with a lead, with some kind of lead on the enemy support, because your contributions are primarily going to rely on your first and third abilities, right? Again, you're going to see this with the Fafnir example, but it's going to be an interesting mid game depending on how well you did in the early game and how good your ADC is in the early game. You could see yourself having a really rough time, but you're basically trying to survive the mid game to have a good late game. But Fafnir in the late game is extremely difficult to deal with if he hasn't been stamped down, basically, right? So a lot of people don't like Fafnir because of that, right? His early game is very ADC dependent. His mid game tends to be, at best, mediocre. And his late game is dominating if he can get there in one piece. But there's, you know, those first two stages that you have to get through. Fafnir is really, really good for duo queuing. If you are a support main and you duo queue with an ADC main, Fafnir is the pick. You are going to have a really hard time getting a better duo pick than Fafnir. Okay? Because you can communicate with your ADC, obviously, a little bit more effectively in a duo queue than you can with a random. So, anytime you are duo queuing and you know your duo queue ADC well enough, Fafnir is going to be absolutely disgusting. Okay? But, for this reason, because most people aren't necessarily duo queuing, Fafnir is unpopular for that reason. Fafnir mains know exactly what I'm talking about, but just keep that in mind. Your early game, very ADC dependent. Your mid game, partially is decided by how good your ADC is, because if your ADC sucked, then your mid game is going to suck because you're behind. If your ADC was really good, you're going into the mid game with a lead, and that's what you really want, because the mid game is going to be a little bit more difficult for Fafnir than it is for comparative other supports. And then that late game comes, and you are just going to slap. Okay? Assuming you haven't been stamped down by a terrible early game and a consequently difficult mid game. But with that being said, thank you all very much for listening or watching. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.